Well, good afternoon and a warm welcome to our second interface lecture for 2021, entitled One Human Family, Christian Reflections on Racism in Science. My name is David Robinson, and I'll be hosting our event. I teach theology and ethics here at Regent College. For those of you who are new to our community, Regent is an international graduate school of Christian studies and an affiliate school of the University of British Columbia, based in Vancouver, Canada. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Regent College is based is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This year, my role also includes being a co-leader for the Regent Interface project, along with my colleague, Professor Ross Hastings. And our focus this year, the Interface project has had several phases, but our focus this year is on engaging the sciences in ministry education. So we're preparing those who are future leaders of faith communities to engage with the sciences in a healthy and critical and constructive way. In pursuing this goal, we're grateful to have the support of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, and particularly its program, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. So we're pleased to partner with the AAAS to bring you this session. Now, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which is the world's largest general interest scientific society, has, along with many other scientific communities, been reckoning with the terrible legacy of racism in our histories. A few weeks ago, their magazine, Science, featured two lead cover stories on diversity and policing, with the statement that big data reveal threats to minorities policed by white and male officers. These stories remind us of the appalling event that shocked many of us into a new level of awareness of these issues. Going back to May of 2020, when George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, was apprehended by police officers. And one of those officers knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, while other officers stood guard and helped to hold him down. He pleaded with them during that time, saying over 20 times, "I can't breathe." His words cannot be forgotten. We are all anxious about respiratory illness today, but that should not sideline the reality that that anxiety is more acutely felt among certain communities of color, and that so many of those people feel that a knee is on their necks. Floyd's death and the deaths of many others since require a number of responses, therefore, from protests through to legislative change. We also have a responsibility in both scientific and faith communities to think carefully about how we speak to these matters. Scientific American, another major publication for a general readership, has been celebrating their 175th anniversary. And in that celebratory issue, they had a feature article entitled "Reckoning with Our Mistakes." In it, they write, quote, "The trappings of science have been misused in these pages to uphold systemic oppression. Under the cloak of empirical evidence, some writers entrench discrimination by framing it as unimpeachable truth." Close quote. This includes the way that the magazine sided with industrial and national expansion over and against Indigenous communities. So as part of that broader reckoning that's taking place, I wanted Interface lectures this year to also treat this topic. And as an important and highly sensitive topic, I'm delighted to host Dr. Deb Harzma, who's the president of BioLogos. BioLogos, as some of you have heard from last night, is one of the leading North American organizations seeking to promote a harmony between faith and science. It was originally founded by Dr. Francis Collins, the current director of the National Institutes of Health in the United States. In her role as president, Dr. Harzma is a frequent speaker on modern science and Christian faith at research universities, churches, and public venues like the National Press Club. Her writing on the intersection of faith and science can be found in several books, which I highlighted at last night's keynote address. But today I'd like to mention an article she wrote in 2018 entitled "One Human Family," which was the inspiration for today's session. Since writing that article, Dr. Harzma has been leading a dynamic network of scholars in the Biologos community as they think seriously about race and racism in our institutions. And they're also helping us to critically consider the way we speak about humanity, ourselves and others, in ways that are more true to the scientific evidence and also more theologically robust and reliable. So I'm going to turn it over to her in a moment here, but let me say a few words about how the session will run. Dr. Harzma will speak for approximately 35 minutes, after which we will have time for Q&A. So if you would like to submit a question, you can do so using the Q&A feature at any time during this session. That's found at the bottom of your screen. There will be no chat feature during the session, but you can submit your questions and comments through the Q&A feature, and then I'll be relaying those questions on to her for a period of approximately 20 minutes after her talk. We'll then conclude with a few announcements and be done around about the hour. So let me turn it over to you, Dr. Harzma. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, David. It is good to be with you again for this session. I've been enjoying my time here, virtually, but being part of the Regent community for yesterday and today and interacting with several of you. So last night I spoke about astronomy. That's an area in which I am an expert. I have a PhD in astrophysics and have done research in that area. Today's topic is entirely different. Talking about race and science is a much more sensitive, it is much more on the minds of everyone in our culture, and it's an area in which I'm not an expert. So I'm speaking to you today as a fellow traveler on the journey, and I want to share with you things that I have learned along the way and things that our organization has learned along the way. So first, I am white. You probably guessed that, looking at my pale skin and my brown hair, which is turning gray here. But what I'm telling you is that I am white in a cultural and experiential sense. So let me share my screen and show you a little bit more background of my family. Just give me a moment here. So here we are. This is my grandmother on the left here in the lower left. Isn't she cute? That's in 1927. My whole family on both sides are immigrants, German Mennonites who came to the United States in the late 1800s and to Canada. My mother's family is from Steinbach, Manitoba. Here's my grandfather farming in 1933, farmed from the days of using horses. And we had all the family tree books on both sides of the family, going all the way back to those immigrant ancestors. We even marveled that people on both sides of the family had come over on the same ship. There was some sharing there. But we never once mentioned that this family farm was on the lands of the Sioux Nations. That was never once mentioned in the story that our family tells ourselves of who we are. And it's the beginning of a pattern that's affected me my whole life, that I have benefited over and over from systems that have kept other people down in ways that I was mostly oblivious to. I really, as a kid, I thought there was a level playing field. I thought that anybody, if they worked hard and they were diligent, like my family was, they could succeed and have the American dream. I did not realize how uneven things were. So I am white in the sense of a social construct and a cultural reality, a system that has its roots in white supremacy and is still reflects that in many ways today. It helped me to read this book, Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. I think part of it is that she is a white woman and my age, and we had a lot of similar experiences. And it helped me understand several aspects of my own culture. One thing that really struck me reading this book was her stories of discovering how people of color are talking about race on a daily basis. It is constantly impinging on their lives, constantly something that they have to wrestle with and fight against the racism around them. But for me as a white person, I can choose to opt out of that. I can choose to ignore race anytime I want and just escape back into my white bubble. And realizing that made me commit to taking the awkward step of engaging race. It's going to feel difficult and awkward. I'm sure I'm going to say the wrong things sometimes, say it in the wrong way, but I'm convinced it would be worse to be silent. So our organization has also been taking steps in this direction. I said a little last night about our organization. BioLogos, our mission is to bring together biblical faith and rigorous science on the most pressing issues of our day, and to do it in a spirit of humble dialogue, of valuing people who have other views. Now, we are a majority white organization. We started out that way. I helped invite people to conferences back in 2013, 2014, where we looked around and went, oh, just about everybody is white. We had not even thought enough about the importance of diversity in that respect. We have since worked hard to add more people into our community, into important roles of being our speakers and being in leadership, but we still have a long way to go. We are convinced, though, that our mission, bringing together God's word and God's world, is not something just for white suburban evangelicals, but it is for all people. So we are working to address issues of race as they intersect with science. We're not attempting to address all issues of racism, but where they intersect with science and healthcare. So today I want to talk about two areas, the biology of ancestry and then the social construct of race in healthcare and science. So first, the biology of ancestry. So looking at this diagram on the screen, you probably immediately have categorized those drawings into different races. We are trained to do this, trained to categorize those people as white, black, Asian, etc. But do those races, those broad 4 or 5 categories that we refer to all the time, do they have a biological basis? Well, let's take a look at what biology is saying. So consider our DNA. Our DNA is stored in our genes and chromosomes, and we have 3 billion base pairs. That's pairs of these letters of A, G, C, and T. Now, DNA is stored all coiled up in the centers of our cells in these chromosomes. But if you uncoiled it and you stretched out the DNA from all of your cells into one long line, it would stretch all the way to the sun 100 times. Okay, I'm an astronomer, I have to put it in astronomical terms, but it's still really amazing how much DNA is in our bodies. Now, of those 3 billion base pairs, those letters of the genetic code, almost all of them are the same for all humans. 99.9% of those 3 billion base pairs are identical for every human. And in fact, our entire species has less genetic variation than one subgroup of chimpanzees. Other species of primates have much more variation across their species than do humans. Genetically, we are one human family. Now, a lot of lies have been told about this over the centuries. Lies that people of one skin color are significantly different than people of other skin color. And that is actually biologically not the case. Biologists know how to classify races and other species. One criteria is to look at the amount of genetic variation that exists within subgroups in that species versus the entire species. Now that there is a quote from Dr. Joseph Graves. He is the first African-American to earn a PhD in evolutionary biology. You can hear him in a BioLogos podcast interview explaining this in detail. So if we're looking at genetic variation, that's how much that 0.1% where we differ from each other, how is that variation spread out between us? So we're talking about the variations here that are traits that we all share. So what are the genes for eye color and skin color, but also for things like your earlobes. So do you know how ears have there's either an attached lobe or a detached earlobe. That's a single gene in your genome, and different people have different ones. And there's all the genes that that account for some of our differences. Now, if you look at those genes that vary from one person to the next, 85% of those variants are found in all world populations. They're spread everywhere. They're not clustered. There's 10% that are clustered on continents and 5% that differ between smaller populations within continents. So although there are genetic variations between different ancestry groups, those are the variations within those groups are much larger than the variation between the groups. So here's a visualization of that. Our popular conception of genetics and race, there's 4 or 5 categories. I've drawn them here as blue, orange, green, and gray. And there's little variation within each one, and they're dramatically different from each other. But what is actually the case is that for different populations, well, there's variation, but those different colors, as I coded them, are spread across all of these. Now, here's this group here in the upper left. It doesn't have any of the orange. This group doesn't have any of the blue. So there are slight differences, but for the most part, these variations are spread across every group. Another way to think about this is geography. So I'm going to show you 2 maps here, and these are geography of genes, and it's genes of indigenous populations. So not looking at all the recent migration around the globe, but looking at those who've lived in their geographic areas for a long time. And there's the geographic distribution of skin color, and you can see that on the map. That's not surprising. That's kind of what we expect. But the social construct of racism would say, well, those with darker skin color also have a whole bunch of genes that are different from everyone else. And that's not really the case. So this is a geographic distribution of blood type. And it's completely different than the other map. You can see, especially in Asia, there's a lot of variation between different geographic populations and what their blood types are. Now, in our cultural conception of race, we would say all Asians are one group. They're all lumped together. But this shows, well, there's more variety within that population than there is elsewhere in the globe. Our social constructs of race lump together a lot of people who are very different, and they don't align with the actual ancestry groups that there are. So here is a chart that defines these 2 categories I've been talking about. On the left, the social construct of race, and on the right, ancestry. There are biological differences between different geographic people groups, but we're talking about over 100 groups around the world. And ancestry would include information about how a person's family history is unfolded over time. It's not a single race. It might be have multiple races contributing. Race is a category invented by society to distinguish between groups of people. It cannot be determined by DNA analysis. You can determine skin color, kind of, but that doesn't tell you the whole story. And the DNA analysis of our ancestry tells you a lot. Race is based on these small, just a few physical traits that are a tiny fraction of the human genome. But in ancestry, looking at the genetics can actually help doctors create treatment plans, since some medical issues are more prevalent in some populations than others. But in general, these are populations much smaller than the continent-wide groups that we talk about as races. So let me give you a couple of examples to help you think of this. People who look similar can have very different genes. So one of the early things done in the Human Genome Project was 3 of the geneticists said, hey, let's check our own genomes. Of course, wouldn't you if you were a geneticist? So we have here Dr. Watson, Dr. Venter, and Dr. Kim. You can see Watson and Venter are white and Kim is Asian. That's how we would all categorize them. And so our expectation is that the 2 white geneticists here would have very more similar genes to each other and would be different than the Asian scientists. And that's not the case. So they all overlap in some areas, of course, but Venter here, one of the white scientists, overlaps a lot with Dr. Kim, and Dr. Watson overlaps a lot with Dr. Kim. They don't overlap very much with each other. They're both more similar to the Asian scientists than they are to each other. So people who look similar can have very different genes. And people with similar genes can look very different. This is an example from biologist Dr. Lynette Strickland. You can read her story or listen to a podcast at biologist.org. She's a sharp young scientist who is a powerful voice for inclusion in the sciences. And one example she talks about is from her own family. And I'll just read here what she wrote. I have one older sister, and we are both biracial. Our mom is Hispanic and our father is African American. My sister takes after our mom, with fair skin that's nearly impossible to tan and silky straight hair that requires heat to have any sort of curl. On the other hand, I took after my dad, with dark skin that only gets darker in sunlight and a mass of coily hair that I've given up trying to tame. Growing up, my mom called us night and day, and in public, people would often ask if we were actually sisters. Imagine your entire reality being shaped by people asking whether your sister was really your sister because you looked too different. So here are two siblings. This is the closest genetic relationship possible, and yet they have very different appearances. So race is real in a very social sense that I will talk about later, but the claims that our broad racial categories that you can judge someone on their appearance just are not backed up by biology. And scientists need to lament this and, as referred to in the introduction there, to take responsibility that our forebears here as earlier scientists, professionals got this completely wrong. And I'll say more about that in a bit. Now, theologically, we are one human family. We need to go beyond the science. Science doesn't define our identity. Even whatever science says about our genes, our identity is defined by who we are in Scripture and in Christ. And that's where we need to look for our identity. And Scripture is clear, we are one human family. There's no hint of different groups being created separately or one superior to the other. Genesis 1:27, it says, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, all of us. And in Galatians 3, Paul writes how Christ overcomes some of overcomes our racism. In Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. One of the powerful things of the gospel is that it brings us together as one in Christ and has the power to transcend our racism and divisions and bring that Christian unity. Now, as I was growing up, I read neither Jew nor Gentile, and I thought, yeah, that sounds right. I was taught to be colorblind, to say, well, everybody has equal merit, and we can just ignore the color of their skin and their race and treat everybody the same, and everything will be okay. I lived for decades with training myself to think that way. But I've only learned recently how deep the problems are with this. First of all, being colorblind like that, it gives you no tools for combating the racism that still exists. People who your peers might be just riding along beside you, say in your classroom or your workplace or your church, and if all you're doing is pretending race doesn't exist, you're not confronting racist ideas they might be carrying. You're not confronting your own latent racist ideas. And it gives you no tools for working for justice if you just think, well, as long as we treat everyone the same, it's okay. Also, it's not biblical when you consider the whole biblical story. And I recently learned this from Dr. Isa Macaulay. He's a New Testament scholar from Wheaton College and author of the Christianity Today Book of the Year, Reading While Black. And you can hear him in a BioLogos podcast interview. Theologically, we are one human family, but with many different cultures that God loves. And Dr. Macaulay pointed to Genesis 22. Through Abraham, all the nations on earth will be blessed. And then culminating in Revelation 22, a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language praising the Lamb. And here, in both cases, is acknowledged that there are different nations and peoples and languages. Macaulay said, to say that at the end of the story that God says, I don't care about ethnicity, would be a strange thing. God says, my whole purpose is to bless a bunch of different ethnic groups. So theologically, we are one human family, but with many cultures that God loves, and no culture that is superior to others. I'd like to pause here and play a video for you that sums up some of the points I've been making and sets up the next part of the talk. So give me a moment here to cue up that video.
About race, about thinking about human.
Our species, anatomically modern humans, are a young species with very little genetic variation. Would you like to know how little? We have less genetic variation than one group of Western African chimpanzees. Our species, in fact, really does not have biological races.
So humans present this conundrum. Science helps us in saying race, right, black, white, Asian, are not biological units. So how is it that humans can be so widespread and look so different and yet share so much in common? That's a huge challenge for science to figure out because that's not the typical pattern for mammals.
My job as an educator is to understand the ways in which race is real and the ways in which it's not real. It is a lived experience. It does have impacts on our biology, but it is not biology.
Americans routinely conflate socially defined and biological conceptions of race. They are not the same thing.
That's what's hard for people to understand, that these social constructs, these ways of being, these structures of history and politics and economics and health are very, very real, but they're not explained by our biology.
Science certainly has been responsible for some of the ideas that we have about race, about thinking about human difference, some that have particularly been damaging to many communities. So I think science has both a role and a responsibility in mitigating that damage.
Racial ideas have been at the root of so much discord in human history.
Their science was filtered through a racist, colonialist bias that they had doing the work.
The tragedy of our past racial thinking is that we have taken what are essentially superficial physical traits and we've imputed great significance to them.
So understanding the science behind human variation allows you to dispel the myth of race.
Now genetics have become a tool where we can explore distant relationships. It can upend the narrative and really cause us to question what we think we know.
When we dismantle racist concepts, it makes it a whole lot easier for us to be able to view other human beings as precisely that. People who have the same aspirations as I do.
Once you've dispelled the biological underpinning for inequality in this country, you're then faced with a political, historical, and social reality. And as a moral and ethical imperative, you have to deal with that. And that's why it's so hard to teach race and racism, because people don't want to deal with how messed up we are and how hard it is to get out of this hole we've dug for ourselves.
All right, just give me a moment to get back to my other screen. So one line from that video from Dr. Torres was understanding the ways in which race is real and the ways in which it is not. I've explained how it doesn't have a genetic basis, but it does affect people's biology because they have to live with the social construct of race, and that does have real impact on health. And that is my next topic here about how race is tied into healthcare and science. First, a couple more definitions I found helpful. This is from Robert Chao Romero. He is half Mexican, half Chinese. He described prejudice as saying, my culture has honor, but yours doesn't. And racism is saying, I will create laws and structures to privilege my people. And because you are culturally inferior, you won't have access to the same privileges. So I will try and use the words in that sense. Because human nature is sinful, sin is ordinary, and that makes racism ordinary, and it is everywhere. As mentioned in the video, a lot of science done in the 1800s had this racism running right through the middle of it. And a big example of that is eugenics. This is Professor Dave Unander, who is an expert in this area. And here's how he explains eugenics. Claims of racial inferiority gradually adopted a pseudoscientific argument that there were inferior and superior races. Now, Darwin despised slavery and described atrocities he saw on Brazilian plantations. So what he's saying there is that the evolutionary science itself and Darwin himself aren't the source of all of this. But the idea of evolution as a struggle for existence, however, was quickly claimed as justification for the subjugation of all peoples under fitter Europeans. By the late 1800s, evolution was the metaphor for eugenics, a program to reduce or eliminate inferiors within European nations while promoting superior types, but also to eventually eliminate inferior peoples worldwide. This was accepted wisdom across a wide political and academic spectrum. And it continued to be widely accepted until the Nazi era, and then it became more of a minority view, but there's still threads of it around today. In eugenics, those who were deemed to be fit were encouraged to reproduce, and those deemed unfit were discouraged or even prohibited from marriage or forcibly sterilized. Now, there is no biblical basis for this at all. In fact, it is contrary to countless passages showing that we are to show extra care for the weak and the oppressed, not to try to eliminate them from the population. And some Christian leaders did oppose eugenics, like G.K. Chesterton. Now, scientifically, it's interesting because eugenics actually doesn't work. So when they talked about unfit, they included a variety of categories. Yes, skin color, but also things like epilepsy, bipolar disorder, alcoholism, physical disability, criminals, deviants, even those with low IQ. Those could all be reasons somebody might be deemed to be unfit. So does it actually work to try to breed those people out of the population? Well, the research attempting to show this was actually not very rigorously done. There were no studies that really showed this worked. And the reason for that is some of these traits that they're studying have very little genetic basis. They're more from environmental and personal choice. A lot of the traits they studied are actually based on multiple genes, not single genes. Remember I said there's a gene for your earlobe? Well, that's a single gene. But a lot of traits like intelligence are based on many different genes, and the inheritance patterns are entirely different. So just allowing one person not to reproduce does not actually eliminate that from the population. And most traits are based on complex interactions between genetic and environmental factors that we don't even understand today. So eugenics is morally wrong, and it's not supported by the science. And yet scientists kept, and many educated people, and sadly many Christians, kept supporting this. And really the only explanation I can think of was white supremacy. They just had this concept that we're superior and others are inferior. And it's a very sad episode in our history, and these ideas are still around today and still need to be fought against. Christians need to be defending the weak, the powerless, and not let others think that we should be not allowing them to live because they're inferior. I used to think that episodes like this, like eugenics and the Tuskegee experiments, that these were in the distant past. These all happened decades ago, and we're past all that, right? Like when I was in the 90s, I would think, well, all we have to do is to just get everybody to be colorblind, as I already talked about, and treat everybody the same way, and then we'll get there. And that's the only problem that needs to be solved. How wrong I was. COVID-19 was this stark wake-up call on the reality of racial disparities in healthcare today. And this was a major factor in my state here of Michigan. This is a little map of Michigan and showing the Great Lakes that surround our great state. In the first 3 months of the pandemic, 40% of Michigan residents who died of COVID were Black. That number now stands at 21% as COVID is spread across our state into other communities. But 21%, but Black people make up only 14% of the state's population. I was a little bit proud of our state because we were one of the first to report the racial breakdown of COVID cases and COVID deaths. But learning these numbers, oh, it's just heartbreaking how large these disparities are and how grievous it is for these communities to lose so many members to COVID. Now, these racial disparities in healthcare, it's a legacy of a lot of the past. There are not as many hospitals hospitals are not uniformly distributed across all of our neighborhoods. Healthy food is not as available, and a variety of economic and social factors. But it's actually from some recent injustices as well. So in 2013, 2014, there was a water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Now that's dropped out of the national news, but it's still regularly in our news here. And they changed the water treatment plant and process in that city and weren't careful enough. And the water that came through to residents was unhealthy and contaminated. And they did not address it right away, and they lied about it. So still today, you can see here a picture of church volunteers that are handing out bottled water because of the problems in the city tap water. And this has so many impacts. It's yet another sign for people of color that they cannot trust leaders. And for me, I'm thinking especially like water quality, that's a scientific thing. Couldn't the people have tested the water quality better? And I'm just frustrated on that account. But resident here, Dorita Taylor, she was interviewed about this, and she says, I just feel like we've all been lied to and mistreated as a city. There's a big mistrust of the leaders who are now calling on anyone who qualifies to get the vaccine. We don't know what's in the vaccine. We don't know what it's about. I don't think it can be trusted this early, and I'm not going to be a guinea pig, so I don't want it. And can you blame her? When somebody's been lied to, it's hard to believe when there's new leaders are actually coming in and working for their good. Her experience is shared by many Blacks and Hispanics across the United States. This was a Kaiser Family Foundation poll in mid-January. The numbers may have changed somewhat since then, I hope so. But nationwide at that point, 47% of the total population said that they had already got the vaccine or would get it as soon as they were eligible for it. 31% had a wait and see attitude. 7% said they'd get it only if they were required to, and 13% said they definitely would not. That's totals, but look at the difference here for Black, Hispanic, and white. White people had much more confidence in the vaccine, whereas Hispanic and Black people were much more likely to have the wait and see attitude. And that's due to these historical disparities that I've been talking about. We need something like 70 to 80% of the population to be vaccinated to get community immunity, to have enough protection that it protects those in the community who are not able to be vaccinated. More healthy people have to have the vaccine. So we have a long way to go. So I've been talking here about a lot of systemic things, economics, water supply, etc. But I really still thought that, at least on sort of the one-on-one interactions, that doctors would treat all of their patients the same with equal, generous care. Well, nope, I was wrong about that too. Turns out, I learned that infant mortality is cut in half when Black newborns are cared for by Black physicians rather than white physicians. Did you hear that? These are newborn Black babies, and if they're cared for by a Black doctor, they are their mortality is cut in half. That means they're twice as likely to die if they are cared for by a white doctor. How can this be? I am just appalled. And this article goes on to say, physician-patient racial concordance makes the difference between life and death for these infants. Even though they cannot contemplate historical traumas, they are still experiencing everyday racism and disrespect. And it's not just in infant mortality. For their mothers, Black mothers are more likely to die in or after childbirth than white women, even when controlled for economic and education level. Other times where personal prejudice is dominant, emergency room waiting times are longer for people of color. And a study was done of kids with appendicitis and found that Black children were less likely than white children to receive the appropriate pain medicine. These racist ideas are embedded in our culture, are embedded in our psyches, and white supremacy is still around. And as over 2020 is when I learned several of these more recent statistics here in healthcare, and I find it just overwhelming and shocking. And one of the things that shocked me the most was how different the reaction was from some of the Black leaders that I heard from. This is Bishop Claude Alexander. He's on the board of directors of BioLogos, and he's senior pastor of the Park Church. And I listened to his sermon in late May. This is right after the killing of George Floyd. And his sermon was on Jeremiah 8, where it says, the crops are in, the summer is over, but for us, nothing's changed. We are still waiting to be rescued. For my dear broken people, I'm heartbroken. I weep, seized by grief. Are there no healing ointments in Gilead? Isn't there a doctor in the house? So why can't something be done to heal and save my dear, dear people? And that is for him, for his congregation, this was just a sign of more of the same, that nothing has changed. And I grieve because I really thought things were improving in our society, and maybe tiny bits in some places, but in so many respects, nothing has changed. And that means for those of us who are white and are in positions of power, we need to be God's hands and feet to bring about the change that they are waiting for. We're not here to be their saviors. We're just here to get out of their way, to dismantle the systems that are keeping other people down. So let me tell you a few practical examples of what can work in this direction. So in 2018, a study was done on how to help Black men bring down their blood pressure, a major source for many of us of health concerns. And they showed that 64% of Black men brought their blood pressure to normal levels after a barbershop-based health intervention, as compared to with only 12% of the control group. So that means that they went into the barbershops where Black men were, these were safe, trusted fixtures within their communities and represent forms of culture and camaraderie for Black men, where they can be heard by someone who can relate to their experiences. And isn't that what we all want from our healthcare providers, is somebody who can relate to our experiences? And when healthcare is done that way, when those kinds of things are used to highlight health issues and get the care and information to people, that actually works. And there are groups now working to use this dynamic to address the vaccination challenges as well. There was an article recently in the New York Times, 60 Black health experts urge Americans to get vaccinated. Black doctors and scientists are speaking out. This photo here is of Dr. Kizmika Corbett. She's an immunologist, and she helped design the Moderna vaccine. There were people of color taking leadership roles in designing these vaccines. Here she is explaining the vaccine to now President Biden, and behind them is Dr. Francis Collins. She does a lot of her time, she volunteers a lot of her time talking about vaccine science with people of color in churches and on Twitter. And her Twitter handle is @KizzyPhD. So those are some voices that we can all be amplifying and letting people know about. Another thing we can do for everyone on vaccine hesitancy is know what messages are actually effective in reaching people. And sociologists are busy working on this to learn how to best convey to people that vaccines are effective. And most of messages here are to let people know vaccines are highly effective in preventing illness. This really works. And it will help prevent you from getting sick. And it is the quickest way for life to return to normal is for most people to get vaccinated. These are messages that work across the board with large swaths of people. And we can be sharing that with our friends, neighbors, congregations, etc. Other things we can do at this nexus of healthcare and race, as I mentioned, amplifying the voices of Black doctors and scientists, and using messages that are found to be effective, making the case in terms of Christian faith. We as believers have a lot of faith-based reasons for doing this. We can convey to people that this isn't, you don't just wear a mask and get vaccinated because some scientist told you to. Scientists are, yeah, they're smart people and they care about you, but that's not the fundamental reason. We're doing it because of our faith in Jesus Christ, because wearing a mask and getting vaccinated not only protects us, it protects the people around us. It is a way of loving your neighbor. And because of our faith in Jesus Christ, we care about the truth, and we need to be correcting misinformation. Because of our faith in Jesus Christ, we need to be working for justice in several of the areas I've just talked about. And because of our faith in Jesus Christ, we need to pray for God to be at work and to bring healing to our nations and our world. So if you want to share more on this, you can share the statement that we did at BioLogos, a Christian statement on science for pandemic times. It was signed by thousands of Christians. You can sign it too, and especially share it with others and let them see the number of Christian leaders from many different denominations and different political parties who signed that statement, and different races, different professions signed that, but sharing as believers this commitment to loving our neighbors through this pandemic. On racism overall, a big question that I know I ask is, what can I as a white person do? And I heard a talk recently by historian Jamar Tisby, and he broke it down, and this is coming out in his new book, the ARC, the Arc of Racial Justice. And he makes it 3 simple steps. A, for awareness, learn the racism playbook so you can counteract it. And I've helped you today in learning more about the facts behind some of these racist things. R is for relationships, real friendships across race. All reconciliation is relational. And C is for commitment. And he emphasized that you can't stop at A and R. You have to commit to making real change to racist systems. So those are the steps we need to, that white people can be taking, that anybody in a position of power can be taking to dismantle these racist systems. We are one human family. Theologically, genetically, biologically, morally, we are one human family. My prayer is that Christians be known as the people who are most wise in discerning science, most courageous in fighting for justice, most compassionate in caring for the sick, most willing to make sacrifices for the sake of others, as we follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harzma, for this thoughtful and broad-based approach to the topic. It's grounded in science and in clear Christian conviction, and we're very grateful for your talk. I'll encourage people now to use the Q&A function. We've got 15 or 20 minutes for discussion, so please feel free to type those questions in and I can pose them to Dr. Harzma. But let me just say on the personal note that I really appreciate you showing us where you are on the journey and your willingness to say that some convictions, like the claim to be colorblind, don't go far enough. I think it's so important for us to say as Christian leaders, I used to think and how wrong I was. And those are certainly statements that I can also identify with when it comes to my own thinking and action presently. So thank you for leading us in that way. Let me start with a question from one of our Regent students. This is from David Raimundo. David holds a PhD in math, and so he's charting this from that angle. And he writes this: we hear nowadays of critical approaches to science that question not only the use of science, but the epistemology itself, including scholars stating that mathematics is inherently problematic for, quote, it perpetuates white privilege, unquote, and bestsellers claiming that the scientific method is itself a white male biased epistemology. Here's the question. Do you think that these claims are really unveiling something true about science and are helpful to deal with prevalent racism in the sciences? Or do these claims go too far since they could lead to an undermining of science per se?
Oh, that is a really interesting dynamic, isn't it? I've just been hearing about some of these things. Like there were news stories of, oh, math is racist. And they tended to come from conservative outlets saying, oh, those wacky liberals, look, now they're saying math is racist. And that ends up undermining a lot of actual work that's being done to dismantle actual racism. So at our household, we Google these things when we hear them, and learned just a few things about this. And I'm not an expert, I've not read the paper, but just I briefly, it seems like what was being talked about there is in math education, when you're looking at a classroom full of students, what are the racism can enter in how you interact with those students. Are you allowing them to get to the correct answer their own way, or do you force them to do it a certain way? Are you acknowledging them as people, acknowledging their potential and skill in those areas? Those kinds of things, I believe, was what some of the underlying research here is. That paper said, well, yes, of course you correct students when they make mathematical errors. There is right and wrong in mathematics, and there is right and wrong, a little less obviously, but often objectively in many cases in science. So, but we are human. Scientists and mathematicians and teachers are all human. And so because of that, yes, racism enters in. I know in my, all of my physics textbooks, it was all white males, Europeans, who were being boom, 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 here's all the leaders of science. There were, in a few of the 20th century names started to draw in people from elsewhere, very few women mentioned. And those are things we can work to correct. Like, so I'm an astronomer, but you know that film Hidden Figures that showed the Black women at NASA in the 60s who were programming the computers and doing the math and engineering? I didn't even know that story. And here I am, a woman in the field. Like there are so many stories we haven't told well and that we've silenced. So there is much to be done in that respect, and much to be done to encourage people of every background to pursue math and science.
Thank you so much for that. Here's a question now from Robert Mann. Robert writes this: how much do you think that scientific arguments of this type, the one you've given, are effective? Isn't it the case that people that are predisposed to be racist will dismiss these arguments, and people that are against racism would still be against it, even if the science supported genetic difference?
Well, yes, that's a really good point. So what does it take to change somebody's mind and thinking about race? Probably these scientific arguments are not going to go a long way with somebody who is a very committed white supremacist. It's still important for all of us to know, like, there's so much information I just didn't even know. And I think it affects how we then set policy, how we work in our churches, how we educate our young people. And those are all very important things to do. And I guess I am still hopeful in one respect that there are many people who are open to change if they did hear better information. Maybe that is a bit unfounded. There is also, Dismantling personal prejudice, I don't have good tips for you on how to actually do that. I'm sure some experts have worked out appropriate ways or somewhat effective ways. Do you have something in that magazine?
Yeah, so this was going to another question that's come up
Okay.
here, but thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. And that's something as well that we'll be discussing later this afternoon when we talk about the pandemic, and just that question of bringing scientific evidence to bear and have someone that's predisposed to reject it, right? And how can you be effective? So we'll bring that into a broader conversation then as well. I'd like to go back to the farm and your talk about where you grew up and your family's background, rather, and early place. And you mentioned that it was the land of the Sioux people. And the Scientific American article that I mentioned earlier ends with an appeal to indigenous scientists who study, in this case, bison grazing, and ask if they'd consider writing an article about grasslands restoration. And it's an example of looking for more partnership between scientific and indigenous communities, and acknowledging, of course, that many indigenous people are scientists themselves. But I wonder if you could speak a bit about the realities of place and land. That's something that Willie James Jennings, in his book, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, he says we don't want to think about land without thinking about place and displacement. And so if you could reflect a little on what it is to know the history of your land and maybe the accumulated wisdom of the land keepers as it bears on the scientific enterprise.
Yeah, that's something I should read more about. Yeah, I mean, one way I know a little bit more about the redlining of how land is handed out housing and who is eligible to get loans for housing, and how people who were not white were deemed unacceptable to get these loans and so forth. There are many things tied to land and place. So I looked for an eye doctor recently, and I probably used to, maybe just look for the best one that had the best medical rating, but I thought, well, let's just plot these out geographically and see where they are. And sure enough, they're all either downtown or in this ring of the rich white suburbs. And the one closest to me is like this boutique, you should see the carpeting and the light figure. It's just gorgeous. And I'm like, well, where our church is located is a predominantly African-American community. And I'm like, well, where's the closest eye doctor for them? And so there are real things about place that matter to us as embodied people, and justice is tied up in that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate how you've charted some of the urban realities here that take place. That's so important. Another encouragement about the Q&A, we still have time for a few more questions if people would like to submit them. But in the meantime, let me ask about, so someone has asked about if you could comment on, some people will say, well, it's just reverse discrimination to start to try to rectify things and talk about white supremacy and so on. How do you respond to that particular position?
Let me respond for how it feels for me to be a woman in physics. So women are very underrepresented in physics. There are many times when I've been the only woman in the room, or one of a very small number of women when I was a graduate student in research groups. I was the only woman in my department at Calvin University. And I know there are times when I got advantages from people who are like, we need to improve and make sure women have opportunities. I think there are times when probably I was selected for that reason, or it was a factor in it. But what I don't know, or have some sense, are the times when it was a negative factor. And I think there are some times that's happened. Now, my husband, white man, 6'2", big guy, deep voice, and he walks into a classroom and gets an automatic sense of authority that a shorter woman has to work harder to get. That's an advantage he has that he didn't work for, and he just has it. And so and he doesn't know how many times has that sort of advantage benefited him, and how many so, but realizing that that's there, he's kind of resigned. Well, there are going to be times where people pass over me because they're looking for a woman to speak or a person of color to speak. I was chatting with Jim Stump on my staff, and was saying something about diversity, and not sure whether Jim should be the person to do a particular thing, because then it would be a panel of all white men. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Jim. And he said, it's okay. We had a good run. And I thought that was just a great attitude, like, we've benefited a long time. It's okay if we sit back for a little bit. And so that's one answer. Another answer is that when you say it's just reverse discrimination, it's not acknowledging the depth of the disadvantage that people of color have been put to, especially the legacy of slavery for African Americans, and the way that is passed down through generations, the wealth that families have been able to accumulate when they're white and not accumulate when they're Black. And it assumes, well, it's just the individuals today, and neglects all of that history. So those are a few reflections on why I'm not worried about reverse discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those. Well, I think then we can conclude our time together. Thank you for engaging those questions and providing us with such helpful material. And in many ways, the resources you've indexed here for us can help when people, as further questions arise, to go to the BioLogos website or to go and link into some of these additional sources. And it's very helpful to have.
Those books and those voices are much more expert in these areas than I am. Yes.
That's great. It's helpful to have the genetics of race conveyed so clearly as well. I think that's information that needs to continue to go out, and appreciate you highlighting especially the work of Dr. Joseph Graves on that point. And of course, for you to effectively show us the very real life and death stakes of the longstanding social construct that is race. And so we're going to get into that conversation more this afternoon. I look forward to that with you, and would invite people to come back at 4 p.m. Pacific time for our dialogue, Christian Ministry in Pandemic Times. So we'll pick up in many ways from some of the concluding slides that Dr. Harzma had on this topic. Thank you, though, for your engagement during this lunchtime lecture. We're glad you could join us. And thanks again to Dr. Harzma for her thoughtful approach and for your ongoing work at BioLogos. We wish you all the best as you continue to address this important topic there. Thanks.
Thank you.